Ontarians were not given notice of or consulted in accordance with the EBR Act about several environmentally significant proposals, including amendments to the Planning Act related to the Minister's zoning order powers. The Divisional Court concluded that the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing acted unreasonably and unlawfully in failing to comply with the EBR Act and consult the public. And a regulation under the Conservation Authorities Act requiring a conservation authority to grant, within a week, permission to a developer to begin development on lands designated as a provincially significant wetland.
40% of the Canadian population, approximately 40% of the GDP generated, and only 22% of emissions are generated. And that's because we're taking action on, of course, investing in transit. For every $2 we spend on public transit, we're investing one into highways to reduce congestion. We're investing in additives to fuel to reduce the emissions in our fuels, and we're working with industry like Algoma with the electric arc furnace to take a massive kick out of the emissions produced within industry, which is, of course, one of our larger sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going to continue taking progress, meaningful action.
In a new scathing review of Ontario's environmental policies, the province's Auditor General says the public wasn't consulted about big decisions and companies have been let off the hook for polluting. Bonnie Lysyk says Ontario will run out of landfill space in 14 years because most businesses aren't required to recycle.
She says taxpayers, not companies, paid tens of millions of dollars to clean up 40,000 oil spills in Ontario between 2016 and 2020, and the number of species at risk is up 22% since 2009. For more on this, let's bring in Phil Poppin, Ontario Environment Program Manager at Environmental Defence, and Ontario Green Party leader Mike Schreiner. Thanks to you both for being here. I'll start with you, Phil, and ask you what stood out to you in this report yesterday.
So what the Auditor General revealed in her somewhat reserved auditor's parlance is a government with no interest in actually protecting endangered species, actually reducing the number of hazardous spills, actually ensuring that recyclable materials don't go to landfill. And this is a big one. No genuine intention of slashing our carbon emissions at the rapid pace needed to avoid a runaway climate change cycle. The government is behaving as though what matters is the number of little announcements that it can make and count on the positive side of the balance sheet. When what really matters is the achievement of these objectives. That is, protecting endangered species, expanding them, allowing them to recover, and actually getting our emissions down. And on all of those points, the Auditor General found that the government just isn't doing what needs to be done, no matter how many little tick boxes it can find to tick off.
So, Minister Schreiner, what is your impression of Environment Minister David Piccini there saying they are going to look into all of this?
Well, this is just a scathing Auditor General's report, and it had the Auditor General fielding questions whether the Ministry of the Environment is actually even there protecting the environment, which obviously protects people. I mean, there were some just astounding numbers. The permits being issued to harm species at risk up by 6,262%. I had to double and triple check that number because I thought there is just no way it can be this bad. But indeed it is. And I mean, granted, some of those numbers did increase under the previous Liberal government, but they've shot up under the current Ford government. The minister says, we're making some investments in transit. Well, we want to invest in transit. Meanwhile, the government is ramping up investments in highways, such as Highway 413, which would pave over 2,000 acres of farmland, 400 acres of the Greenbelt, cross 85 waterways that protect our water, protect us from flooding. My gosh, look at what's happening in British Columbia right now. We need to do everything we can to protect Ontarians for flooding. All of that to save commuters 30 seconds and would ramp up climate pollution. Right now we're facing a climate crisis. We have to urgently reduce climate pollution. And instead of pulling the fire alarm, Premier Ford is pouring more gas on the fire.
Yeah,
Phil,
the core planks of this government's agenda, I agree with Mr. Schreiner. The core planks of the agenda that the government seems to be planning to campaign on in 2022 are things that no government would even consider doing if it genuinely believed that climate change was a reality. Government is clever enough not to admit what it really thinks about climate change because Ontarians won't stand for it. But we know what a government thinks from its actions. A government that believed that climate change was real, a government that believed that it's something that needs to be tackled, it would not build the 413. It would not build the Holland Marsh Highway. It would not be approving and forcing MCRs, which are basically boundary expansions for municipalities that are going to build and mire Ontario in 30 more years of sprawl. These are the core elements of the agenda the government is pushing. And a serious government, a government that recognizes that environmental limits on what it can do are as real and as mandatory as fiscal limits on what it can do, a serious government would throw all of these core platform planks in the garbage and start from scratch.
Okay, I want to read for you a statement from Environment Minister David Piccini's office sent us this today. Obviously, transparency was an issue that came out of this AG report yesterday. And the minister says, Ontario is leading the nation in reducing emissions and is taking continued positive steps to meet our 2030 emissions reduction targets. Goes on to say, there is a lot of work happening on public engagement. We'll continue to do that work with accountability and transparency. To be clear, we've met every single one of our legislative duties to consult as laid out in the Environmental Bill of Rights, and have an ongoing education campaign to ensure Ontarians are aware of those rights under the Act. Minister Schreiner, how do you respond to this statement?
Well, the courts would disagree with that statement, and the Auditor General would disagree with that statement. I mean, basically, the Auditor General has said there is pretty much no way this government is going to meet Ontario's the Ford government weakened Ontario's 2030 climate pollution targets. The bottom line is climate pollution is going up under this government, not going down. Any emission reductions that happen in Ontario happen primarily due to the coal phase out prior to this government taking office. And the bottom line is the largest source of climate pollution in Ontario is transportation emissions. Building Highway 413 and building the Holland Marsh Highway will supercharge climate pollution because it's going to supercharge sprawl, and it's going to force Ontarians to commute hours more every day just to be able to afford to find a place to call home. We have solutions. We can build connected, livable, affordable communities where people can live close to where they work, where they can access electrified public transportation, where they can drive electric vehicles if they need to. We can retrofit people's homes to make them energy efficient and lower people's energy costs and climate pollution at the same time. But we have to have government policies that make it affordable for people to do that. And that's not what this government is doing.
And if there's that political will then, Phil, we're going into an election year. We have 1 minute left in this discussion. We're going into an election year. And we've heard from Mr. Schreiner there, but what do you want to hear then from a politician? Or are you hearing something from a politician abroad? Is there an example of a government that's doing this right?
I would actually turn to the municipal government in Hamilton that's showing us how to do it right. And we're seeing hopeful things in Toronto as well. What we need to do is use the next 30 years of new jobs and new homes in Ontario to retrofit all of our existing neighborhoods and turn them into complete communities with room for everyone who wants to live there, but also densities and mixes of uses and transportation systems that allow people to get by without a car. We were doing things a lot closer to the right way before World War II. It's not something new that needs to be invented. We just need to get back to those tried and true ways of building communities where owning a car is not necessary. It can be possible, but it's not something that's needed. And our environmental objectives just simply aren't compatible with this back to the 1970s approach that the government seems to be structuring its entire agenda on.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there for tonight, gentlemen. We appreciate you making time for this conversation. It's ongoing. I hope we can continue it as we see more people caring about climate change and the environment. Thank you for tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.